everyone, it's Megan and Melainie and Miley from Balanced Eating Disorder Treatment Center, and today we want to discuss some common misconceptions about eating disorders.
Right.
Yeah. So Melainie and I were speaking off air, and we were chatting about just a few of the misconceptions people have about eating disorders, and we thought it would be helpful to share with you. So Melainie, what are some of the ones that you notice in your work?
I think that first and foremost is the idea that vanity causes an eating disorder. And I just ran actually a group this morning and we were talking about it with family members along with some of our clients. And this idea that maybe I caused the eating disorder because I wanted to lose weight and I went on a diet and now I've got this raging eating disorder. So first and foremost, the idea that vanity was the reason that this developed. And vanity or fear of weight gain is the reason why it's being maintained, even if it's ruining my relationships or, I'm getting fired from work or whatever. There's this misconception that vanity is the main stronghold, when in fact we know it's the opposite, but vanity really has very little to do with it. Vanity is the gateway behaviour, or triggers the gateway behaviour, I should say. In other words, in our culture, what we know is that if you lose weight below where your body is meant to be, for those who have a genetic predisposition to developing an eating disorder, and particularly anorexia, this is where the research is, then we believe that gene kind of gets switched on or switches on the illness, if you will. So, certainly the weight loss triggered the manifestation of the illness. But the illness was already there in the first place.
I imagine that's why, when you tell someone who's struggling with an eating disorder, you look great, you're not fat, you don't need to lose weight. What are you thinking? That's why it's not helpful.
It is so not helpful. It's so not helpful.
Okay.
And another part of that too, around the vanity piece, is that there's a part of the brain that starts to get distorted as you lose weight. And we know from malnutrition that the neurocircuitry in the brain starts to change and people start to see what is not there. And by that I mean when they look in the mirror, they end up with a distorted view of what their body actually looks like, which seems to propel them to want to lose more weight or continue to do what they're doing because there's this large mass looking at them that, is their own body. So there's a lot of complexity to it.
Yeah, no kidding. So what other misconceptions do you notice?
Well, a big one that a lot of family members come in and say is, why won't my daughter just eat? Just eat, damn it. And I know that on the surface it appears that way, right? So why don't you just eat? Or why don't you just eat consistently?
Right.
But the reality is that we know for some people their brains are structured in a way where in the absence of food, there's actually a dopamine response. Now, dopamine is your feel-good hormone, right? Your feel-good chemical. When you do something that makes you feel good, you do it over and over and over again, right? And this is how we therefore know to usually seek out food and seek out, sex and seek out these things that are very pleasurable. So for some people, in the absence of food, they feel better. This dopamine response is going on. So when you think about that, then if we're asking those clients to eat something, we're taking away a dopamine response. We're actually making them feel even worse because their anxiety is going through the roof because we're asking them to eat something. In other words, it becomes a hell of a lot more than just someone being obstinate or wanting to, get back at their parents and being willful by not eating. It's far more complicated than that.
It's an addiction.
It is, yes, in that sense. Yeah.
Sure. And any other misconceptions you want to share?
I would say another big misconception is that an eating disorder is just an eating disorder, and if we weight restore you, you're done. Or if we get you back to a consistent eating plan, it's all over, you're done. But what we understand now is an eating disorder is very rarely, if I would like to say maybe even never, just an eating disorder. It's a whole perfect storm of 70 to 80% of us with an eating disorder or who have had an eating disorder. There's anxiety, there's depression, there's often OCD traits or obsessive compulsive, which falls within the anxiety. Perfectionism is another trait. And I was just recently at a conference down in Vegas actually last week, and they were talking about even more traits that we're finding and that we're seeing around what we call set shifting or cognitive rigidity. And very simply, that just means the ability to tolerate change, for example, without having a complete meltdown. And what we're seeing more and more of is that these traits are present before someone actually develops the eating disorder. So it's actually very validating, I think, because we know that these are the behaviours, you know, the intolerance to change and perfectionism and OCD and orthorexia and being very obsessive around your calories. We know that these are behaviours that go with the eating disorder. But what's so helpful is to know that these were traits that were there before, and now they're just manifesting through food and weight and exercise. So it's validating in the sense of like, these are some of the basic personality traits of the people who then develop this illness. And it helps us to potentially in the future be able to identify the high risk kids in elementary school, for example, you know, like the kid who has to write their paper over and over because the writing's not perfect enough. Hello. you know, those kind of traits, you know, the insomnia because you're so anxious at night that you can't sleep. Anxiety, anxiety might be there, right? So some of this stuff was really just, it was there, but we didn't know how to identify it, or also is it just a phase my kid's going through, you know, you don't want to over-medicalise it. But nonetheless, I'm finding the research to be extremely helpful with identifying some of this underlying stuff. So again, in summary, what that tells us is that eating disorders, the more we learn, the more we realise that they're even more complex than we thought they actually were. You know, it just kind of feels like a bottomless pit right now. But so incredibly important for not just people who are struggling with an eating disorder, but also especially for family and loved ones to educate themselves so that they can manage their own expectations around the behaviours they're observing, and that those behaviours are not are not their loved one. The behaviours are a part of a manifestation of this illness, you know.
So, wow, those are great misconceptions. So essentially, it's not all about vanity. It doesn't have to do with that. You know, you can't just eat to make it better, or like once the weight restoration happens, it doesn't necessarily mean the eating disorder is recovered, you know, or healed. And then finally, you know, there are characteristics that occur before the eating disorder manifests, you know, and usually underlying struggles such as anxiety or perfectionism or OCD or trauma or you know, other things that you mentioned, for which the eating disorder is actually a manifestation. And those issues may still be there afterwards, so it's important to treat the underlying causes and not just the eating disorder behaviors themselves.
Absolutely not, and I think that's where people come up short because they just weight restore if they're able to, and that's it. And so they never work through the underlying stuff, which leaves them vulnerable for a recurrence of the eating disorder. And that's why we understand the relapse rate to be so high, right? Or one of the reasons.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much, Melainie. This is really helpful.
That's great. We'll see you again next time.
See you next time.